what you have to realize is that you've got an agro-ecosystem that's basically on life support, right? And it's going to need time to recover. It's going to need time for the soil life to become rejuvenated.
Hi, and welcome to this episode of Voices from the Field. I'm NCAT Communications Director Emilie Ritter Saunders, and I have the pleasure of welcoming NCAT Sustainable Agriculture Specialist Nina Prater and Lee Rinehart, who are here to chat about the new toolkit we've developed for farmers and ranchers who are transitioning away from synthetic fertilizer or want to know how to start that transition. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Hi, Emily. Thanks.
So before we get into the conversation, I want to pause for a really quick celebration. This is the 250th episode of Voices from the Field. So that means for 5 years, we've been connecting you with sustainable agriculture experts from around the world, farmers and ranchers who share with us their own trials and successes, and of course, the practical information that we're known for. So a big cheers to 250. Thank you for listening. You can find all 250 episodes at attra.ncat.org or wherever you get your podcasts now, including on Spotify. So hooray for all of us.
You
Yay.
bet. Awesome.
Very exciting.
So now we'll get into the good stuff. Anyone in agriculture has likely been watching the cost of synthetic fertilizer continue to climb and watching the cost of global food prices continue to shatter records. And we know that there's another way to produce healthy food. And in fact, consumers increasingly want their food produced without synthetics. Nina, I'll kick it off with you first. Why is it that we're seeing such a huge increase right now in input costs?
Thank you for that question. It's really gets to this complex global trade system. So with synthetic nitrogen in particular, that cost is directly linked to natural gas costs because it takes a lot of energy to create synthetic nitrogen. So anytime the natural gas production gets interrupted, and if there's less natural gas on the market, you're going to see synthetic fertilizer costs go up as well if the supply is limited. Also, of course, with the war between Russia and Ukraine, the sanctions that we've put on Russia to try and end the conflict, there's a lot less natural gas on the market right now, and that leads to price increases and Russia produces a lot of the fertilizer also. And so there's just a lot of disruption in that market. And so the prices are going up and up. And, right now it's happening because of a war, but it can happen at any time based on any kind of disruption in that whole system. So it's kind of volatile and, unreliable in terms of costs. That's one thing that can go up or down very easily.
And I know, Nina, we've talked about as we pulled together this toolkit that those input costs are so volatile and dependent on factors outside of our control, right? A war happening on the other side of the world that folks couldn't plan for. And so we know that farming without those synthetics, not having to rely on those costly or volatile inputs, is within reach, both for large and small scale producers. We're not just talking about home gardeners. Is that right, Lee?
Thanks, Emily. That's a question that I get a lot. Regenerative practices, those types of practices that allow us to scale back on those costly inputs like fertilizers and pesticides and such, have been questioned at large scale a lot. And really, I think that's because of a paradigm that started back with the Green Revolution back in the 1960s. We all know that back then, the advent of crop genetics and pesticide and fertilizer use really ramped up and saw agriculture start to really get industrial in a sense. In the 70s, Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz basically was about maximizing output, just produce all that you can and sell the rest overseas. And I mean, he did that for a reason, I mean, he did that in response to a farm policy that he thought would stifle farm productivity. And by paying farmers to, leave land fallow when the prices were low, they'd store the grain and then they'd push the prices back up the next growing season, right? So it was Earl Butts and fence row to fence row, right? Let's get as much productivity as we can. So what we have now is a mature ag industry that kind of relies on those inputs to maximize productivity. And that's why we have this reliance on these synthetic fertilizers. But many farmers are realizing that they just don't have to remain on that treadmill. We've mentioned several in some of our work, Dave Brandt and Gabe Brown, lots of people that are well known who are kind of the shining stars are using regenerative practices basically to kickstart that soil food web of microbes to provide all the nutrients that the plants need to remain productive. And they're doing this on a large scale. I mean, these guys, we're talking about farms that encompass thousands of acres producing commodity crops. But also, while they're using these practices to reduce their inputs, they're also maintaining and regenerating those soils, which we have to remember are microhabitat. And that habitat is where all of the microbes live, and they do their good work in order to make these crops productive. So basically what I do in my garden with cover cropping and rotations and keeping soil covered has been empirically shown to scale up.
So, and we know also that consumers want food that's produced in this way, right? The demand for certified organic, in particular, other regeneratively produced foods, that continues to go up. The sale of organic products in the US has gone up more than 30%, and the number of organic producers is up almost 40%. That's according to USDA stats since 2016. So, farmers who use regenerative methods but might not be all the way certified organic, those folks are no doubt on the rise too. Nina, I know that that's how you're producing food on your farm. Can you tell us a little bit about your place and how you've been able to remove nitrogen fertilizer specifically from your own business?
Sure. Our farm is located in Crawford County, Arkansas. It's a hilltop cow-calf operation, and we also raise meat goats. It's a family farm that my husband's grandparents have owned since the 60s, and for a long time, they did continuous grazing, and they had one Tyson broiler house on the farm. So that was, for a long time, that was their source of fertility. And then they didn't really manage the cattle in any particular way. They just let them graze wherever. And then in 2010, my husband and I decided we wanted to help them implement a rotational grazing system to rebuild the soil, to get more productivity off of the acreage, and see what we could do that way, see how we could reduce our input costs. And we used a NRCS EQIP grant to do a cost share on fencing and things like that. And so since 2010, we've been rotationally grazing the cattle, and we've seen a huge improvement in the soil. We do soil testing, and so we've seen our organic matter percentage increase. Visually, we can see an improvement, and there's a lot more productivity. Now, for the fertility, for nitrogen specifically, this whole time there was a healthy stand of white clover in the pasture mixed in. And so from what we understood, if you have 25% of your pasture in a clover or a legume, then you don't need to apply fertilizer in a grazing system. And once the broiler house was closed, that was I think in the early 2000s, there stopped being a free source of chicken litter, which is a great source of nitrogen. And so we stopped using that, and the pastures just continued to improve under this rotational grazing system. It turns out, that really helped, but it wasn't necessary when the livestock were managed carefully. And so we haven't used synthetic fertilizer on the farm in, I can't remember the last time, time. It's been a long time, decades, and it's super productive. The inputs we bring onto the farm are hay. So we feed hay in the winter. The cattle it's an entirely grass-fed herd, so we don't bring in grain. But we do bring in hay in the winter, and we unroll the hay bales to feed them, and that supplies some fertility to the fields. In whatever hay is left over, it just returns to the soil. So we think of that as one source of fertility. And then the clover fixes nitrogen naturally and adds it to the soil system. So yeah, we don't need nitrogen fertilizer. We don't ever even think about buying it, just because, why waste the money on something you don't need?
Will you say something, Nina, about, what is step one? Where do you start sort of in the path that you and your husband have taken on your own farm? And if somebody's just thinking about this today, where do they start? And it feels a little bit overwhelming. What do you do first?
Well, the first thing you can do, I would say, is look at the fences that you've got. Some people already have fencing and they already have gates. What they could do is get all their livestock on one side of the gate and shut the gate. Let them graze in there for a while, and then move them to the other half of the farm and let that other area rest. The key to this managed grazing is allowing the plants recovery time. And so even just dividing your farm in 2 fields improves things. If you divide it in 4 sections, that can improve things. And there's really low cost ways of doing this, with like polywire electric fencing and things like that, depending on your setup. Everybody's farm fields are set up differently. And, you also have to think about getting water to each of those paddocks. But if you start with just a few subdivisions, it really will improve your grazing efficiency. And, NRCS is a great resource to go to for technical assistance. Even if you don't do their cost share programs, they can come visit your farm and give you ideas of what they would recommend. And they're just a really valuable resource that I think people should definitely tap into for technical advice.
Thanks for that, Nina, and thanks for clarifying a little bit. And we talk about these things in the new toolkit, and that's what we're here chatting about today, the toolkit on how to reduce synthetic fertilizer use. You can find it at attra.ncat.org, and that's what we're here to discuss. Lee and Nina, you've both explained that this transition away from synthetic fertilizers, it doesn't happen overnight. So Lee, could you walk us through really what it looks like to start this process, or maybe if somebody already has started and are sort of ready to take that next step, sort of what does that maybe 3 to 5 year transition really look like for somebody?
So the first thing I would say is just take it slow and have a plan. What you have to realize is that you've got an agro-ecosystem that's basically on life support, right? And it's going to need time to recover. It's going to need time for the soil life to become rejuvenated. Right. And it could take that 3, it could take that 5 years. I would start small, start with what right? Start small by perhaps trying to cover crop in the fall after the cash crops comes off. Or if you're a grazer, maybe, learning a new grazing management style that's more adaptive and kind of rely on pasture rest and recovery, like what Nina was saying, to maintain that productivity, right? And observe and adapt. I think that's the main thing. We can't be too hard on ourselves. We have to realize that it's a slow process. And what's most importantly for now, weaning ourselves off of that nitrogen very slowly through that, what we'll talk about later, a 20-30-30 process that's talked about by Christine Jones a lot. She's a really fabulous soil scientist from Australia. Basically, we need to learn from our mistakes, just, because you're going to make mistakes as you go, and just don't be hard on yourself when you do it. Have the courage to stick through it, not be tempted to kind of revert back to those costly inputs. Like you might see fertility going down or productivity going down, and the first thing you're going to think of is, oh man, I got to get some nitrogen on there, but just have that plan to wean yourself off slowly, stick with it, and you'll realize cost savings in the input reduction. And then as the soil starts to regenerate, you'll see productivity coming back because those soil microorganisms are going to be doing that good work. Most importantly, it's a natural system we're talking about here that needs to come back into balance. And there's lots of farmers and ranchers who've made this transition. And so listen to their stories. I mean, we talk to a lot of them on the ATTRA podcast. We talk about them in our blogs and in our work. And that's what we try to do, is just like show what some of these successful people do. So it'll help others who are on that road, so that they can have the courage to stick with it too. Because it's not easy whenever you see an unproductive field and you know that you could just fix it right now. So it's not an easy road, but it can be done, and it has been.
Lee, I think it's important to maybe pause or go back to something that you said, that, folks might notice a dip in productivity within that first year, but don't rush out to the store and grab fertilizer right away. And you're saying, you're going to have sort of that cycle where you might see a dip and it will come back.
Yes, and it will come back. That's why it's important to take it slow and have a plan. You might increase other enterprises at this time. You might look for other ways to make sure that you have secure income or whatever, but plan for a couple of years of tribulation. Again, I wish I could just say, yeah, here's something we could put on and make it better. But again, this system has to come back into balance, and that takes a little time.
Yeah, and I would add, a lot of times, farmers are risk averse, and there's a good reason. It's a risky business, and it's scary when you're risking your whole year's income potentially. Yeah. And so some people recommend to try something out on like 25%, 10% of your land. Try, if you're nervous about cover cropping and reducing your nitrogen inputs, try it on just a portion, something that you can afford to lose if it doesn't work. There is a learning curve. So, don't risk the whole farm on one change, because, it takes time for farmers to learn this stuff, and for the soils to adjust. I always talk about soil, and a good analogy for soil health is human health. And so for me, the nitrogen really supports an unhealthy system. And so if you take all that away and then expect that soil to perform when it doesn't have its support, it's not going to. It'd be like somebody telling me, Nina, I think you should go out today and run a marathon. Go ahead.
I'm thinking of cutting out, Diet Coke or coffee cold turkey. You need a few days to get off of it.
Yeah, exactly. I would not be successful at running a marathon today. Now, if somebody said, in 1 year, Nina, I need you to run a marathon, then I could take steps to make that possible, theoretically. So it's just like the human body. Like, if you're super unhealthy and one day you decide, I'm going to be healthy, and you cut out all the bad things and you eat a salad, you're not healthy yet. It takes time to build that up, So soils are very similar. It takes time to transition, to build back the soil biology, and to make it function like it did before we intervened with all of these artificial inputs.
So in simple terms, we tried to sort of narrow this down maybe to 4 steps, right? 4 sort of actionable things. So we're talking about planning for diverse cover crops, this 20-30-30 transition, alternative soil amendments, and managed grazing, which we've talked about. Nina, do you want to explain, or Lee, either of you, to explain sort of what we mean with the 20-30-30 transition, and also why are cover crops key to all of this?
Yeah, I guess I can take the 20-30-30, and that comes right from Dr. Christine Jones's work. She wrote a really good article called Nitrogen, the Double-Edged Sword, and anybody can find that on amazingcarbon.com or org, one of the two. You'll find it. Just Google Amazing Carbon. Basically, she recommends a path for reducing your commercial nitrogen fertilizer over a 5-year period. So she starts with about a 20% reduction the first year, followed by 2 years of an additional 30% reduction, culminating with 2 years of minimal applications of around 4 or 5 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. And when you get down to that point, it's just a little bit to get it going at the beginning of the year. So you're given time for all of the soil bacteria to come to life and to really populate and to start mineralizing all of that nitrogen and making it available for plant use. So just think of 20, 30, 30 over 5 years. That's the basics of it. But I know a good friend of mine, and Nina as well, Dave Scott, used to work with us here at NCAT, and he raises sheep out in Montana, and he did this himself. He tried it, and he followed her advice for 4 years, and it really proved successful. They have been off of nitrogen fertilizer since 2017 now, and their organic matter level has gone up to about 5.5% in a high valley in Montana. So it's known to work, but realizing that it's a slow process, and you gotta really kind of, wean yourself off over time and be careful to do that. You can be successful.
Nina, do you want to take the part of the question there on cover cropping? Why are cover crops key to the success of this?
Yeah, they are really key because they accomplish several things in your field that are super important to building back the soil biology, because it's those microorganisms living their life cycle out that cycle the nutrients and make them plant available. And the cover crops, they protect the soil and prevent erosion and keep the soil a temperature at which the soil microbes can function. And they also directly feed the soil. So plants are like little carbon pumps. So they photosynthesize and then they exude like sugars and things like that into the soil system and feed those microorganisms. And so it's sort of like an if you build it, they will come. Like there's a lot of dormant bacteria in the soil at all times, even a degraded soil. And if they're just given the foods that they need and the conditions that they need to grow and multiply, they will. And so you can build back your soil biological system that way, and your soil food web. And having diverse cover crops is really important because, different microorganisms associate with different types of plants. And so if you have diversity above ground, you'll have diversity below ground, and then you'll have microorganisms that can function in all different types of conditions, wet, dry, hot, cold, so that there's nutrient cycling as much of the year as possible to feed the crops that we're trying to grow. So cover crops really can boost this whole process. And they're really
I think, Nina, what I think is cool about that, because you're talking about plant exudates, and I think that's just remarkable. What's really remarkable is that on average, about 30% of plant photosynthate is actually exuded back out to feed those soil microbes. That's a lot, and we really don't think about that, but I like the way you put it, that those plants are little carbon pumps and they're feeding those microbes down there. And then the microbes are mineralizing that stuff and giving it right back. It's amazing how that works.
It is amazing. And I think most people think of cover crops as a way to, increase biomass through the leaf and the root matter, which is really important. But there also is that 30% that's exuded into the soil. That's not just that's not by accident. The plants do that to make the soil an environment in which they can thrive. So it's really amazing. It's really amazing process.
So the methods that you're both describing here, it's all about finding ways to naturally or biologically add that nitrogen back into the soil. Nitrogen's a necessary ingredient. And it seems to me that transitioning a farm back to not using synthetic fertilizers is really mostly about patience and trial and error, as we've talked about. How can the toolkit that we've developed at attra.ncat.org take some of that guesswork out of the process for farmers and ranchers?
Well, I think it's a good starting point for learning some techniques to get off reliance, right? It allows folks to do some deeper digging into some of the resources that we have, highlighting some successful farmers, to give them confidence so that they can take control of their operations and they can reduce costs and build back that crucial soil that we all rely on. What do you think, Nina?
Yeah, I agree. I think the more you learn about this whole natural process, you can take that information and adapt it to your own operation, because every farm is different and every farm is going to need to make the transition differently and design it to meet their location, their type of production, and things like that. But learning sort of the overarching principles, and then learning what other farmers have done and what little pieces can I take from all these different farms or resources, what can I do that will work in my specific environment? What can I achieve, with my resources? So yeah, it's a great way to start the process and figure out what is my first step going to be. Is it going to be the fall cover crop? Is it going to be inviting the neighbors cattle to graze my cover crops? Or there's so many different ways you can do this to jumpstart your soil health. So I hope we've compiled enough resources for people. And then if people have more questions, there's always the ATTRA helpline and Ask an Ag Expert email. And so we're here to answer the specific questions too.
Yep.
Thanks, Nina.
No, I'm just going to say that it's a great entry point into starting on a whole new adventure. It changed your life.
Nina, Prater, and Lee Rinehart, thank you so much for your expertise and really delivering a practical guide for farmers and ranchers who are ready to start this process, move away from synthetic fertilizers. We'll provide some links in the show notes for NRCS and Christine Jones and some of the other resources we've mentioned here. Are there any final thoughts from either of you? Anything that we didn't cover that's really important to touch on?
I just think, like Lee was saying, it is an adventure, and I one of the inspiring things I've heard from so many farmers, and that I've felt myself on our farm, is that this is a beautiful process. Like, once you get in this mindset of how can I encourage more life, more diversity, more growth, more productivity in this really sustainable and positive way, it gets kind of addictive, and it becomes, there's always challenges no matter what your type of farming, but it becomes more fun almost. It's such a joy to be out on the farm and hear the birds and see the dragonflies buzzing around and see all of this diversity around us in these beautiful landscapes. And so I think it's so rewarding on so many levels, not just that you are reducing your input costs, which is really important to stay in business, but it's just so rewarding on so many levels that I think people will really embrace it once they start down that path.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at attra.ncat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Rich Myers. ATTRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATTRA Sustainable Agriculture program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.